is happening? Welcome to Your Forest. It's me again, Matthew Christoph. And today I've got somebody on today that I haven't been trying actively to get him on, but I've been thinking about trying to get him on for a specific subject for quite some time. I finally reached out to him. He immediately agreed to come on, and I am so excited that you guys get to listen to him talk. His name is Marty Luckert. He is a professor at the university, as well as a bunch of other stuff. His research area includes economic development, forest economics, natural resource economics. He's an economics guy. He taught me forest policy and forest economics in university. I remember loving his class and forgetting to take notes because I was so enthralled by the lecture he was giving. He was just really good at making it make sense and pulling out the important information and making you see the bigger picture, not just what's in the textbook, right? He was really good at that. I loved it. So yeah, I was able to bring him on, and I just asked him what he wanted to talk about because he's a good talker and he can figure it out. And right now he's in the middle of researching biofuels and the economics around biofuels from forest residue, so from wood chips and branches and that kind of stuff, creating ethanol, that like the type of ethanol you add into your gasoline for your cars and stuff like that. And so we talk a lot about starting off with I don't know, I can't remember what we started off with, but talking about how much land you need, how efficient it is, what kind of proportions we should be expecting of gasoline, how it's going to help with climate change and with carbon sequestration. Do we use natural forest harvest residue, like from normal cut blocks in the bush in the wild, or do we do forest plantations on private land so we can get quicker rotations and other stuff like that? Or maybe we use a totally different crop. Maybe we don't use wood at all. Maybe we use something else. So we talked about a bunch of that kind of stuff. It was really, really interesting. Lots of information there. Lots of twists and turns, and not exactly a clear picture, but a very interesting picture nonetheless. Also, the last half, we got pretty heavy into carbon tax and trying to get people to understand why carbon is not being valued at its actual market value. It's being undervalued drastically. And it was really interesting. I didn't know that, and listening to him talk about it was pretty fascinating because he really knows his stuff. This is his area of research. And it was really awesome to get him in here to talk about this kind of stuff. So I know you guys are going to love it. You will, definitely. I know I say that for everybody, but you guys are definitely going to love this. Marty wanted me to mention future energy systems. They develop energy technologies of the near future, examine their integration into current infrastructure, consider the social, economic, environmental impacts. Yeah. He wanted me to mention them because they're helping him out with funding and allowing him to do his research. So thanks, Future Energy Systems. So today we've got the same three sponsors. GreenLink Forestry. Could not do this without GreenLink Forestry. I got a space because of them. I have the opportunity because of them. Thanks. Also, I have the Forest Resource Improvement Association to thank as well. Couldn't do this without you guys either. Thank you very much. Also, Damaged Timber is another sponsor, and they are a apparel company out of Edmonton here, and they're trying to give back to the environmental sciences community through a scholarship. So 10% of the sale of all their clothing goes towards a scholarship for environmental sciences. And they have really cool hats and toques and sweaters and t-shirts, all kind of stuff. It's all, the t-shirts are more athletic fit, so if you don't like athletic fit, you can just hold off, and he's going to have some more normal fitting t-shirts soon, I think, probably in the fall here. And he's giving out the first scholarship in the fall, I believe, as well. So if you guys want to check that out, go to damagedtimber.com, put in Your Forest 10 at checkout, you get 10% off. And that's it. So without any further screwing around, it's Marty and I. It's going to be a good one. You guys are going to like it. All right, here we go. Ethanol from trees. How does that work?
So there's basically two different types of ethanol that are being considered for biofuels right now. And the first kind they refer to as being first generation. Okay. And that's not tree stuff. Even though ethanol from trees has been around for a very long time, first generation ethanol, the stuff that you see at Mohawk and in the pumps and stuff like that, is coming from sugar or starch-based stuff. Okay. That means it's coming in Brazil from sugarcane, and in the U.S. it's coming from corn. Right. A little bit of wheat in Canada, but most of it's sugar and corn. Okay. And those are the two big producers in the world, by far the largest producers. Canada produces like 2% of the world's ethanol.
Oh, okay.
So we're small. We're small dogs there.
I imagine the States with the corn is probably
like Brazil and the U.S., I think they account for in the 80 to 90th percentile of the whole market of the world, right? So they're big.
Well, corn's in everything. I mean, you can't get away from it.
And the U.S. did it by subsidizing very heavily corn producers to do this.
Right.
So that's referred to as first generation ethanol. Mm-hmm. Second generation ethanol is different in that it has a cellulose base, right?
Oh, okay.
And as soon as you start talking about cellulose, that's when you're starting to talk about trees as potential sources. Mm-hmm. You're talking about residues from forests instead of full trees. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, from a forest, you can take it from dedicated energy crops by planting trees, or you can take it from the bits and pieces. It refers to being able to use residues from crops, right? The straw that doesn't need to be left on the ground and stuff like that. Okay. So there's cellulose is kind of this, it's looked on as being a potential panacea because it gets away from a lot of problems they had with respect to sugar-based first-gen biofuels.
Gotcha.
First-gen stuff, if you recall, there were some big issues about, oh no, we're eating we're stealing it off of plates, right? Because you're basically taking food and putting it in a gas tank. And some of the ethics that society saw in terms of that were not very clear. So there were some big problems associated with that. And so a lot of politicians right now are saying that we're not using plants anymore in terms of sugar and starch, stuff we can eat to go into gas tanks. We're going to concentrate on cellulose now.
Gotcha.
Which means that all of a sudden forests become a whole lot more front and center as a potential place to get this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what we started looking into more. We started out by looking at, I mentioned previously, there's kind of two different ways you can think about it. One of them is in terms of growing dedicated crops, like aspen or willow or something like that.
So it grows fast and
you cut it down. You can either coppice it or grow it for about 20 years and cut it. There's different ways you can do that.
Right.
So there's either crops or the bits that get left over from other processing, right? And those bits are kind of two different places. One set of those bits is at the on the roadside, right? In Alberta, mostly right now, as most of the listeners of this will know, whenever they harvest the trees, they limb them at the roadside, and they pile them up right there, all the brush up right there, and they burn it at roadside, right?
Right.
So there's a bunch of cellulose at roadside, which right now is just going straight into the atmosphere.
Right.
And so the other bits that come off while you're debarking and stuff like that, that stuff is already used pretty heavily for other types of products. And so there's probably more interest now in trying to figure out the viability of using the bits at the roadside as opposed to the bits at the mill side.
Yeah.
Because that stuff has no use right now. It's a cost. Yeah. And it's also, in terms of carbon emissions, right now it's going straight up.
Yeah, it's waste. It's just being burnt and used as nothing.
So if you make biofuel out of that, right, it's going straight up now. Well, yeah, when you burn it as biofuel, it's going straight up too. But there's no change on that side. But you are avoiding fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
So there's actually a big jump in carbon emissions because of the carbon balance associated with that.
Okay.
So that's why people are quite interested in the cellulose stuff, and that's where forests are being considered more and more these days.
Right. So with the residue itself, harvest residue and stuff, because are we talking about bringing a small go-to mill to the site and creating the ethanol on site, or shipping it to a refinery and building it there?
So the refineries, this technology is changing fast. It doesn't really exist in a stable state.
Oh, okay.
But the concept right now is that these refineries are likely to have very large scales. And so you need to feed the beast. This stuff needs to come into these refineries from very large areas potentially.
Right.
Potentially bigger haul distances than what we do right now for pulp mill, for example.
And do you think that'll be economical, fuel-wise?
That's yet to be determined. We're working on some of those things and trying to figure it out. A lot of the problem with trying to figure that out is it's technologies that don't exist. There's moving targets in terms of costs, and we don't really have the calculations done. We're working on that right now, actually, trying to figure out how far do you have to go for certain capacities of plants, how much is out there, and it's not just a static thing. If you think about it, you think, oh well, the forest industry cuts an AAC every year. How much of that is going to be residue? How much are we going to have? Well, but that AAC varies considerably over time.
Yeah.
And this mill can't say, "Oh, I don't have enough this year. Sorry," right? You got to feed the beast.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that variability, thinking about portfolios of feedstock, because not only are you likely going to need to get this stuff from forestry, you're likely also going to need to get this stuff from ag residues.
Right.
And that stuff varies quite a bit associated with weather, right?
Yeah.
Big crops, small crops.
I'm thinking even like along the ditches, like, you know what I mean? They're swathing all that.
There's lots of different variables to try to figure out how much is out there. And so a lot of the work so far has looked at, okay, well, this is how much is out there in a snapshot.
Yeah.
But turning that into a flow, and an uncertain flow one, right, that's stochastic, is a lot of the work that we're working on. And a lot of that, the source of that stochasticity can be market forces, which is why I, as an economist, am interested in that.
Right.
And the team I work with is full of economists that we're trying to model this stuff.
Right? Yeah. No, for sure. It seems like there's a lot at play, like to try and make it worthwhile monetarily. And,
to try to figure out, well, hey, this is a lot of money they need to put in these plants, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And it's potentially you could only fit, maybe 1 to 5 or 6 of these things in all of Alberta.
Oh, okay.
Depending on how big the scales are, depending on how much of the stuff you can get, and so forth. So that's some of the stuff we're doing right now, and some of this has been done, but we're doing it more in a stochastic sense, is how much is out there, what could it support, and then we'll get more specific with respect to the costs of hauling and the costs of production and those types of things.
So you don't think it'll be a situation where we can take like each individual mill or like big factories of some kind have their own biorefinery that they can create their own ethanol?
So you're talking about a pulp mill, for example. Can you put a biorefinery next to every pulp mill?
Right.
Potentially, but
Right.
It doesn't look like it. It looks like you're going to need,
Larger.
what are there, 10 to 15 pulp mills or something like that in Alberta, something like that.
Sure, let's go with that.
And so it's not looking like you would have that many biorefineries.
Okay, so you need a larger factory.
Yeah, it's not likely going to be FMA based.
Okay.
Because it's not likely going to just be trees either, right? Because like I said, it's likely going to have to be mixed with other stuff.
Okay, so I guess we should talk about, because some people might not know what ethanol is used for, like what kind of fuel.
So when we're talking about ethanol, the reason people are so interested in it is because there's not that many options for transport. Right? Mm-hmm. Transport is liquid-based fuels. Yeah. Now, it's true that now we're going more and more to electric-based transport. Yeah. And when I say transport, I mean light transport and truck transport and all kinds of stuff, right? Yeah. Electricity is on the verge of making a much bigger comeback in transport, but it's still quite a ways from being big. Gotcha. So even though we've kind of turned the corner on the domestic car market, for example, or for light transport and cars, with respect to electric vehicles and lithium batteries and stuff like that, still the vast majority, and for some time, is going to be liquid. Yeah. So if you're trying to deal with that segment, and you're trying to deal with carbon reductions and so forth, where are you going to go? Well, it's got to be some kind of liquid fuel. And so when we talk about ethanol in this sense, what we're talking about is, like I was saying before, it's that 10% that they stick at the pump. Mohawk has been doing it for a long time, and other ones do it too. Yeah. But you've probably heard me say a couple of times now, 10%, right? Yeah. One of the problems with this stuff is there's this thing called a blend wall. Okay. And the reason it's only 10% is if you go beyond 10%, you got to have special changes to engines. 10% mix, so 10% ethanol and gasoline. Exactly, and 90% ethanol and 90% gas. Yeah. So you've seen flex fuel cars and stuff like that, and some of them even say E85 on it. Oh, okay. Those can actually go up to 85% ethanol. Oh, okay. And there's a significant stock of vehicles, for example, in Brazil that do that because they make so much ethanol. Gotcha. But in the United States and North America, most of our vehicles are not flex fuel. Even though it's not a huge deal to make them do that, the stock of vehicles we have can't eat more than 10%. Yeah. So there's some room to head in that direction and then have the stock change over time. But in the short run, we're at about 7 to 8% in terms of what our consumption is. So there's not a lot of room to get up to 10%, because we've been putting ethanol in our gas in Canada for a long time, according to renewable fuel standards, and even some of the provinces have those too. So there's federal ones and provincial ones. Right. So on average, we're at about 7 or 8% of the gas of ethanol in the gas that we burn right now. Right. So what's the advantage of, because people might think about, well, ethanol, you're still burning like a carbon-based
fuel, right? So you're still releasing carbon into the atmosphere. What's the carbon footprint difference between that and fossil fuels?
So again, it depends on the circumstances, right?
Of course, yeah.
So if you're talking about ethanol being made from that roadside waste,
Yeah.
okay, think about right now we're burning fossil fuel. That's emitting carbon.
Yeah.
Okay, if we switch over to ethanol,
Yeah.
that carbon doesn't get burnt. And that ethanol is already being burnt and putting into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So now we're just that stuff that's already being burnt is being burnt in a gas tank, and we're substituting that for the fossil fuel. So it's almost 100% gain. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that because of the spread of how it gets produced, and you got to haul the stuff around, and there's emissions from that.
Okay.
But basically, the ethanol is already going into the atmosphere.
How's that? You just mean through
because it's being burnt at the roadside.
Oh, sorry, I see. So the ethanol in the trees that are
exactly.
being burnt on the
Sorry.
Okay.
So the carbon in the trees that's going to go to ethanol
is being burnt
right now. If you look at before versus after, right, that's what we always think about. So before, right now, well, the stuff that would be turned into ethanol is being burnt and going to the atmosphere. The fossil fuels are being burnt and going to the atmosphere. After, there's no change on the ethanol side, or very little change.
Right.
And the fossil fuels aren't being burnt.
But you're getting energy that we can utilize,
so that you still get the energy.
Got you.
But
so you can reduce
the carbon's footprint goes down substantially, which isn't always the case. That's actually as complicated as it might be. That's more straightforward than it is with corn, for example.
Oh, okay.
So starch and sugar-based stuff is actually more complicated with respect to whether or not you get a gain.
Oh, okay.
In terms of
that's
the carbon footprint.
The big question, right? People are like, well, is ethanol more environmentally friendly than gasoline, right?
It used to be more complicated, but now it's almost collapsed to that.
Okay.
So why do we want ethanol?
Mm-hmm.
Is ethanol good and why?
Yeah.
Right?
Perfect question.
so that's the beginning.
I should have started with that.
Well, that's kind of the beginning of the conversation. And it used to be there were more reasons that were important. Mm-hmm. One of those reasons clearly is the carbon footprint, right? Yeah. So that's what we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Another of those reasons is energy security.
Yeah. Because
a lot of the energy that we burn, especially in terms of oil right now, comes from places in the world that are highly insecure. Mm-hmm. But that argument is being reduced now because, for example, the United States is getting close to being energy self-sufficient with fracking. There's lots of different ways that in places now, there's more places to get energy such that countries aren't as worried about energy security as they used to be.
Right.
So that reason isn't quite as big as it used to be. So the biggest reason now is, like you were saying, environment-friendly gas.
Yeah.
We're thinking about CO2, and that's the biggest issue.
Yeah, for sure. Climate change, it's a big one.
Another of the issues used to be, well, we need biofuels because we're running out of oil.
Yeah.
And we're going to run out and we're getting peak prices and stuff like that. And there was a time when we had these these $1.50 a liter stuff, and people were saying, oh, we're running out of oil. We're not going to be able to afford to drive to our cottages and stuff like that. That kind of never came up, really. That never came true. And if you look at proven reserves of oil over time, despite the fact that it's a non-renewable resource, the proven reserves are fairly constant. Because when the price goes up, we go out and find more. Now, you can't keep doing that forever.
No. Well, and we get better at finding it, too.
Exactly.
Better. We can go deeper. We can go all kinds of stuff, right?
Exactly. So now most people aren't thinking, you know what, the problem isn't that we're going to run out of oil. We don't need to do biofuels because of that. No. The problem is that there's in fact, a lot of the countries that have a lot of oil, Canada included, are now worried about the fact that, you know what, we might not be using fossil fuels when we still have a whole lot of this valuable stuff in the ground. So we might get left with a bunch of fossil fuels that are worthless.
Right.
Because it's going to be substituted for other things because of CO2.
Right. Because people will value the lack of carbon being put into the atmosphere.
Or governments will make them value it with carbon taxes and other things, right?
Yeah. No, for sure.
And so there's some pretty big issues. So it's gotten simpler, actually. Mm-hmm. Why biofuels are good are largely because of they can have lower CO2 footprints than fossil fuels.
Okay. Is the efficiency similar to fossil fuels, or
that gets kind of complicated? And I'm not even.
It's all complicated.
But this is stuff. This is complicated in an engineering sense.
Yeah.
I was actually trying to learn more about this with some of my engineer buddies the other day.
Yeah.
So strictly speaking, ethanol does not have as much energy density as gasoline.
Right. And
I'd have to look this up, but I think
seems like nothing does, really.
Yeah. So it's like 60 to 80% in that range.
That's still pretty good.
Of what fossil fuels have.
Okay.
However, it's not that straightforward because when you use it in proportions, this is what my engineer friends were trying to explain to me. When you use it in proportions, it can actually be more efficient than that 60 to 85% because the way it mixes with gas.
Oh,
so it's not just a straight add on, right? There's some kind of efficiencies that can be gained when it's mixed as an additive.
Right.
And so depending on whether it's E10 or E85, I think it has different amounts of energy density in aggregate when it gets mixed with fossil fuels.
Okay.
That's my understanding anyway. You should have an engineer on here to tell you about that. But.
Yeah. No, that's a whole other thing. Yeah, for sure.
But so it's pretty desirable in terms of that.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't drop as much as you might fear.
Okay.
Because fossil fuels, I mean, compressed dinosaurs, how are you going to get better than that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. Eh? Yeah. So technically speaking, it's not that the carbon footprint is less. It's just that we're now that carbon would have been burnt anyways, and now we are utilizing that carbon. So at least it's being put towards something, right?
It's.
I guess people are going to get hung up on that, right? They're going to say, "Well, are we actually reducing the carbon footprint of ourselves?"
Yeah. So the life cycle analysis people say yes.
It is okay.
And those are people who look, they go beyond what I was just talking about when you talk about, okay, well, it's being burnt anyway and those types of things, to thinking about the whole production process, right? And that's where you have, you're talking about the trucks that haul fossil fuels. You're talking about the trucks that would have to haul these biofuel bits, right? And the emissions that they have,
right?
And the factories and what they're emitting and all that kind of stuff. So they think about a much larger footprint than just
the amount of time it takes to grow the thing that you're trying to use.
Well, and then, when if you're talking, that's kind of
another thing.
Well, the forestry people spend a lot of time with that for forest fires, right, and carbon emissions.
Yeah.
All carbon, there's a time dimension to storing carbon. And forests can store carbon for a long period of time or for a short period of time. So when you're talking about dedicated energy crops, for example, for biofuel, and you cut them down after 20 years and release the carbon because it goes into, should you get a carbon credit for that? Well, you've stored carbon, you've sequestered carbon for 20 years at an increasing amount, right, over time.
Right.
But then you've released it after 20 years when you burn it.
Yeah.
So under what circumstances should you get a credit for that? Well, most provinces and most protocols say, you know what, we're not going to count carbon unless it gets stored for 50 years. We have to say how long, because any carbon can be released at some point.
It's all being sequestered and released all the
constantly.
Time.
Exactly. So how do you draw that line? Well, some provinces say in a protocol, or some governments say in a protocol, if it's not 50 years, that's non-permanent. We're not going to mess with it.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, 20 years can be a pretty long time if that gets you the technology you need to catch up to climate change. They're talking about sequestering carbon out of the air with machines now. Right?
Yeah.
So if we can hold off for 20 years, should you be getting credits for that 20 years that you're storing it on the stump instead of releasing it? Well, maybe that should count as something.
Yeah. No, it's,
So there's a lot of issues about that. That 50 years is kind of arbitrary. It's kind of arbitrary. Not arbitrary means without meaning, but it's a shot in the dark, right? With respect to, 50 years is permanent, but anything less is not, and anything more is permanent, not any better than permanent, right?
No, for sure. So you're talking about like dedicated crops for this kind of stuff. So right now, we talk about residue versus, so you're still trying to figure out whether or not shipping residue from like a harvest site is economical, right? We're still trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
And I imagine it'll get more economical over time with technology and whatever. But I was going to ask you about, because like a lot of your papers are about plantations, right?
Yeah.
So the idea behind hybrid poplar plantations that grow, and you got a 20 or 28 year rotations, you cut them down every 20 years. We don't have a lot of that going on. I know there's some, but there's not a lot, right?
No, and the reason we don't have much of this going on is because, let me back up. So to start with, in most Canadian provinces, you can't put these things on Crown land, right?
Yeah.
Because we have rules which say that we need to try to replace the forest with trees that are similar to what we're cutting down. So there's all the seed zone rules which say that, you got to use seed collected within this kilometer distance.
So the genetics stay the same.
Exactly. So they're trying to replace exactly what's there. Now, there's a lot of reasons to think that we should be thinking about that in different ways now. Biofuels is just one of them, and exotics in terms of biofuels. I mean, there's all the concepts about, with climate change, should we really be replacing the exact same forest?
Yeah, and that's a whole nother...
That's a whole nother thing.
I talked with Barb Thomas about that, actually.
Yeah, she'd be good about those types of things. And so thinking about, planned migration and those types of things are big issues. And so that's one reason to get away from banning exotics. But this is another one, right? Yeah. Another one is to think about, if we allow exotics on Crown land, then we can think about a much bigger land base, and we don't have to necessarily compete with agriculture to be able to grow dedicated energy crops. And so right now, as it stands, basically, if you want to grow these hybrid poplar, you're pretty much, I mean, there are some experiments that can be done on Crown lands, but you're pretty much pushed onto private land.
Right.
And so if you're doing that, that means you got to compete with ongoing agriculture, which means that a lot of the modeling we did in this front had to do with land use change. Right. Under what circumstances would landowners have incentives to switch from whatever they're growing right now to some kind of cellulosic, or we looked at switchgrass too. Another dedicated energy crop is switchgrass, which is a perennial which you harvest every year.
Right. Okay.
So kind of like a faster coppice of poplar or willow.
But I'm guessing the same thing. The price per unit is probably not competitive.
So right now, if you're on ag land and trying to compete with agriculture, there's a huge gap. Yeah. Right? To make it come online, you would have to subsidize 2 or 3 times. Right now, it's subsidized about 17, or it was 11. I think it's 11 cents a liter. It'd have to be like 2 or 3 times that subsidy level.
Gotcha.
To make it come in.
Yeah.
And then it wouldn't be much still. And there's all kinds of wild things that would have to happen. So right now, most of the research we're doing is showing how far away we are, what that gap looks like. That's not to say it's not going to close.
Right.
I mean, if you think about all the money that was invested in oil sands over years to make that technology work, I don't know this. I don't know exactly what the numbers look like, but I imagine they had similar gaps when they were doing this stuff 30 years ago.
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
So now, what we're doing is saying, okay, this is where we are. This is what we need in terms of technological change or in terms of whatever you think about doing.
Yeah.
In another sense, carbon taxes could help this stuff because it'll help the biofuels and penalize fossil fuels, and that could translate down into higher returns for biofuel growers too. So
that makes sense.
So there's all kinds of again a lot of moving parts to try to figure out under what conditions this will come online.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would have a hard time, and I know this is not your area of expertise, but a lot of people would have a hard time with the exotics on public land, right? And for good reason too, right?
Absolutely.
But I think that's something that, like you said, with climate change and other things, it's not exactly as clear as it once was. But
so we actually. A couple 3 years ago, I went down to Calgary and talked to the Alberta Wilderness Association.
Yeah.
Because we were doing some work on this, and if you think about it, what we were showing is that let's say that if we treat our AACs as something we're going to hold the line on, okay, we want to make sure we get our AACs, be able to continue that right now, but
annual allowable cut. Yeah. Some people might not know what that means.
Yeah. Sorry.
So the amount of trees being harvested.
Go ahead and translate.
Yeah.
If we hold that line and don't do more. One thing that we could potentially do is if we stuck exotics on public land, we could reduce the footprint of forest industries quite a bit.
Right.
And so there could be a whole lot more set-asides if we held that line on AACs. And so there was actually some environmental groups that were quite interested in hearing those stories and, how much could we actually reduce the forestry footprint if we did that?
Right.
And so I actually went down and gave a talk to the Alberta Wilderness Association. It was supposed to be somewhat tilting their heads a bit, right? A bit controversial.
Yep.
And they invited me in to talk about this stuff, and they were open ears, right? They weren't. I don't think I swayed anybody, and I wasn't trying to sway. I'm just trying to tell them, hey, let's think of this what if story.
Yep.
And they're interested in thinking about it.
In the end, a huge first step, right?
It is. Well, I mean, and I don't know if it's a first step or a last step, right?
Yeah.
But it's
if you can get people to listen, that's a huge step forward.
There's some trade-offs to consider, right?
Yeah.
And to ignore the trade-offs is to consider potential ways forward that we should be thinking about.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there are a lot of good reasons not to have exotics on public land. One of the key things that I was pointing out too is, will we hold that AAC line though? If all of a sudden we let exotics on public land, then will the government say, okay, well now we can produce twice as much?
Now we can cut more.
And so those protected areas or those smaller footprints might not necessarily persist.
And it'd be hard to tell them not to, because that means if you could cut more, that means more jobs, that means more money, that means more. And
now all of a sudden we got a public forest that looks more like a agricultural operation than a forest. And so there's lots of other types of values up there that you're sacrificing when you go to that kind of a plantation.
Well, this is kind of a side note, but that's one thing I was going to ask. If you go to a plantation route where you're harvesting every 20 years, you're harvesting these poplar, right? Do you I would think you would need to start adding fertilizer and stuff to keep, because like the whole idea of forestry is that it's sustainable because we don't need to add anything to the soils, right? We're not depleting the soils the way agriculture does, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, as you ask these questions, you probably realize, there's lots of different disciplines involved, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not a soil scientist.
No, I know.
But I don't think it's that big an issue. At least whenever we do our simulations, people don't say, oh, well, you can't assume that you're going to get this amount in the second rotation and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
If you're going over 20 some years, I mean, I'm sure there's something happening there.
Yeah.
And you can't do it indefinitely, but I don't think it's a huge issue on that side.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to coppice, it might be a bigger issue, but again, you got the wrong guy trying to answer that question.
Okay.
Because,
coppice is,
every 3-4 years, you cut it off from the same stump.
Okay.
And then you replace the stumps every, 20, 25 years. I can't quite remember.
Gotcha. Okay.
But then that's when,
instead of removing and replanting.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you're, it's more intensive, right? You're pulling more out of the soil.
Right.
You might have to worry about it sooner there. But I don't think those are the biggest issues that people are worried about. I don't think they're worried necessarily so much about the long-term productivity of the soil, although soil scientists may be.
Yeah.
But the bigger issues that I think people talk about are, is this a forest?
Yeah.
Is this a forest that we want?
Mm-hmm.
On public lands, there's a reason we have a green zone and a white zone.
Yeah.
Are we turning the green zone into a white zone if we allow this to happen?
Yeah. Green zone being trees, white zone being agriculture.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, and you're talking about increasing the AAC using exotics and stuff like that. That was an interesting thing that I read in the one abstract you sent me, was regarding whether or not we can, as Canada's going for this natural forest method, right? So we're trying to move towards harvesting in a way that is more indignant of a fire or whatever, right? Whereas other countries have plantations and are harvesting every 20 years versus every 70 or 80, and they're growing faster and they're growing. So there's an argument that we might not be able to keep up with the timber market and the wood fiber market. You think that's going to be a concern?
Yeah. Again, it's about comparative advantage and what you can do. I mean, it's not necessarily the best thing for us to try to be horribly intensive. Mm-hmm. Because in Canada, we have a huge land base, right? We got cheap land. Yeah. We got high labor costs. Mm-hmm. And so it's the opposite situation of that would suggest that you should be intensive, right? If you don't have much land, and if your labor is cheap, then put a lot of intensity into each hectare of land, right? Mm-hmm. So to begin with, we got some structural things which suggest that extensive forest management, not intensive forest management, is a good way to go. Yeah. Now, having said that, the way financially, the way that we're spread out, we got a lot of land, a lot of cheap land is way out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. We got expensive labor and inputs. So, hey, let's try to minimize that and do small intensive forestry. Right. But as long as you're in the realm of indigenous species, of natural species, then that makes some sense. Right. But as soon as you start flipping over into exotics and open up that door, then that's something which can change the picture. Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting to me that if you look at intensity within that realm, right? If you look at it within the exotics, the less intense stuff still wins. Okay. So that 20-year rotation, that's a pretty extensive option relative to that 3-year rotation, right? Where you're planting at much higher densities and cutting every so and so, but it's financially horrible.
The shorter rotation is bad.
Real short rotation where you harvest every 3 years and that kind of stuff. The returns on that are horrible relative to the 20-year-old rotation.
Really?
When we say 20-year-old rotation, that's kind of the bottom end. There's actually, the way we model this is with trying to figure out the optimal time to plant depending on prices that are, the optimal time to cut depending on prices that are changing. Right. And so the optimum rotation can be anywhere between like 20 and 27, 28 years.
Gotcha. So
we're modeling that with constant change and stochastic events to try to find out, okay, when do these trees really come down? And so it's a window, not a time. Mm-hmm. And so but within that realm, then I'll say it again, within that realm of exotics, we push it toward the higher financial returns are pushed towards the more extensive margin, where most people wouldn't consider a 25-year rotation to be very intensive.
Right.
In that realm.
Right.
If you think of eucalyptus plantations at 6 or 7 years, if you think of coppice plantations at 3 and 4 years and those types of things, a 25-year rotation is still a pretty long rotation.
Yeah, big time,
in plantation worlds, right?
No, for sure. Yeah, if you're working there, you might see one rotation if you're lucky, right? Like 2 is going to be like you'll be working there a long time.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's just interesting. It seems like the biofuels needs it's going to need a lot of subsidies, like you said, to get going. And I wonder if it's I guess it's one of those things that's going to it'll be a part of the solution to trying to eliminate fossil fuels. It's not going to completely take over for fossil fuels. I don't think we have the land base or the fiber to try and support something like that. But I guess the idea is every little bit helps, I guess, right?
Well, and the part that we kind of started talking about earlier is to think about too the fact that there are segments of energy, right? There's electricity and there's liquid fuels for transport, and those things are to some extent substitutable.
Right.
But I'm actually quite surprised when I think about it to the degree that they're not more substitutable.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think over time they will become more substitutable, but right now, if you can't get gas, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Right. You can't. Yeah, you can get an electric vehicle, but that's a huge step.
Yeah.
And so to get that substitutability across liquid fuels and electricity, that's still a pretty big technological chasm that we're well on our way towards, but that's still a long way to be able to do that.
Well, and especially considering the electricity is coming from coal burning anyways, so what's the...
In some cases, but I mean, right now we seem to have a lot more options when it comes to electricity generation.
Yeah.
I mean, solar's coming on gangbusters. We got better batteries. We've got lots of different things we can do.
It's exciting, yeah.
And we can even, cellulose can go in both directions, right? A lot of the pellets that are being done right now are going to electricity. Some of the stuff that we model has outputs. The biofuel outputs as being ethanol and pellets, or ethanol and electricity. So the production from the cellulose can go in 2 different directions.
Gotcha.
But
I imagine the pellets are cheaper to make, but it's
Well, the pellets is kind of a funny story too, because the reason we make pellets in Canada is because it's heavily subsidized in Europe.
Oh, okay.
So Europe has big subsidies for using renewable fuels, such that they're burning this stuff in converted plants that used to burn coal and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so virtually, the reason we make pellets in Canada is because we send it to Europe, and the reason Europe wants it is because they're heavily subsidized.
Gotcha. And they're using it to heat their homes and stuff like that, right?
We do that here.
Well, you said it was also for
we do that
coal
too,
burning plants.
but they actually do have central heating facilities that they've transformed to use pellets from coal. And there's some electricity generation that way too.
Yeah. Again, for me, it comes back to the carbon question again, right? And it's I know you said it's a complicated. I have to talk to a carbon specialist, like a modeler, to discuss that situation, right? But I think everything that moves in that kind of direction is probably.
But the bottom line of that stuff, when you think about the carbon balance stuff, okay, why we have a CO2 problem is because the stuff that we're burning in terms of fossil fuels was put under there thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Not millions.
And so so everything is on a cycle, right? It all goes in the ground. It all gets released eventually. But that stuff's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old. And so CO2 and global warming right now, the problem with that is that, okay, that stuff's been sitting there for a long time. We're releasing it. And the only way we have of sequestering it right now is through a plant system. Right. But that plant system is releasing too.
Yeah.
So if we just had that plant system releasing and sequestering, we'd be pretty well balanced.
Yeah.
So the plant stuff is pretty well balanced, right?
Yeah.
It's the fossil fuel stuff that throws it all out of whack.
I think people get confused with that too, though. They don't understand. They're like, well, no, we can't possibly impact the CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's like, listen, guys, there's, like you said, right? There's carbon trapped in the middle of the earth. It's not being released. It's been there for hundreds of thousands or millions of years.
Yeah.
And we're pulling it out by the barrel and releasing it, and it ends up in the atmosphere. It's
the cycle that we have to deal with that it's not set to deal with that. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
The vegetative cycle is pretty much a wash over not huge frames of time, right? Because the trees grow, they get cut, they grow, they get cut, and maybe that's a 50 years time cycle, but that's nothing compared to what we're talking about with the CO2 in fossil fuels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the source of the problem, right?
Yeah.
And so anytime, and that's the general logic of switching towards
I see. That makes sense. That makes sense.
biofuels.
Because, like, yeah, okay.
But the problem is that it's not so straightforward for a lot of other reasons too, because whenever you're making biofuels, you're using fossil fuels lots of times.
Right.
And so there's various amounts of that. With the first generation biofuel stuff, some of the problems were that they were thinking about the possibility of land use change towards corn in the United States.
Yeah.
So you've got this CO2 sequestered in forests. Now all of a sudden the agricultural land base expands because of subsidies in corn. And so you're losing CO2 and sequestered in forests, sticking it into something which is burnt right away in terms of biofuels. And so you're losing there, right?
Right.
So it's not as straightforward as just saying, okay, fossil fuels are bad, biofuels are good.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of grays in between, especially when you're talking about starch-based. But generally, cellulosic-based stuff tends to be, especially depending on where the cellulose comes from and what it would do anyway. But usually you're using stuff that's going to go up in the atmosphere pretty fast anyway. Mm-hmm. So you're switching away from that big stock of fossil fuels that's causing the imbalance into something which is just part of the balance, part of the cycle.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I've never heard it said that way, but that totally ties in. Because, like you said, the plants are there, they have a good cycle, and we're just utilizing that cycle, whereas fossil fuels
we're messing with it, and we can elongate it or shorten it or just do different things to it. Mm-hmm. But, not on the same time scale as...
Gotcha. So right now, as far as big hurdles for biofuels and ethanol to kind of take off from biofuels, you're talking about subsidies and more land base for it, right?
I'm not. I have to be a little careful here. Mm-hmm. I'm not. Economists have a hard time suggesting what we should subsidize and why and how.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
That gets pretty political pretty fast.
Yeah.
So I don't want it to be interpreted that we're saying, okay, we need more subsidies for biofuel.
Right.
There are cases to be made that the technology needs to be subsidized because there's infant industry arguments that suggest that, unless there's a concerted effort towards improving the technology in these sectors, it's not going to get off the ground.
Of course. Which is true of all new technology.
Of lots of different, not all necessarily. Well, some of them, organically evolved with in a garage or something, right?
Right.
But typically it takes a pretty heavy investment. I mean, think of Korean cars and how much had to be invested in Kia and those types of organizations to be able to compete within an established industry, right? And Hyundai and so forth.
For sure.
So there was a lot of subsidies at the beginning so that they could compete with the big boys, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Fossil fuels are big boys.
Yeah,
so to
big
try
time.
So to try to bust into that, we're talking about some potential infant industry arguments to need to do that.
Yeah.
Now the question though is that another big related question is, but how do you do that, right?
Yep.
And there's big arguments out there with respect to, well, should Canada have done this with renewable fuel standards?
Right.
And renewable fuel standards basically say, okay, well, if we require it, then it'll give people incentives to make it.
Right.
And it kind of did to some extent, although in Canada what we did was we actually subsidized it directly as well. And then we added renewable fuel standards on top of that. But it also makes us import ethanol from the United States.
Right, yeah.
And so the fact that we have to have X amount of ethanol in our gasoline, it definitely does push ethanol forward.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the best way of doing it.
Okay.
And so when you think about, well, should we increase renewable fuel standards? Even if we just go to the blend wall that I was talking about earlier of 10%, is that the way we should do it? Well, wait a minute. What are we doing when we do that? We're saying that let's treat ethanol as being the answer. So let's subsidize it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of economists have been thinking more along the lines of, well, maybe what we should be doing instead is going to the root of the problem. And like I said, the root of the problem actually became a whole lot more simpler over time. And the root of the problem is carbon.
Right.
So what should we do? Well, if we just tax carbon correctly, then everybody, electricity, solar, ethanol, everybody's responding to that environment.
Yeah. And
then we're giving everybody a level playing field.
So many people are going to argue the hell out of that.
They will.
People hate it, right? They just go, "No, you can't tax carbon." It's like, because I understand where they're coming from, right? We're dependent on it. They got us to where we are today. But I mean, it's been a long time coming, right? Like they've been talking about taxing carbon for I don't know how many years. Like it's been decades, right? Like it's something that the way I try to put it sometimes to people is imagine that CO2 was not an odorless, invisible gas. Imagine it smelled like farts and it was purple.
Yeah. Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to see downtown Edmonton. You wouldn't be able to see anything, right? Like if it smelled like shit, we wouldn't be releasing it the way we are, right?
Well, which is why people have a hard time believing in it, right? It's hard to.
And then we would be taxing the hell out of it, right?
Yeah,
Like, no, if you're going to use that, then you have to pay extra for it, right?
Yeah.
So and I think, but people don't think about it that way, right? So it's.
Well, I mean, the basic premise is again, one of the things that bothers me to no end is, the economic illiteracy of society in general, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that, in Canada, everybody's surrounded by an economy, and the little amount that they get in high school, they come into university and that's where they start to learn about economics, right? They get almost nothing in high school. Yeah.
Microeconomics is literally, this is supply, this is demand. You're like, well, really? Okay.
But that's the basis for figuring out what's going on here, right? Yep. And what's going on here is the fact that CO2, like the purple fart, is something which we don't like. Yeah. It's a bad. Mm-hmm. It's something which is considered to be pollution because it's thought to decrease environmental quality. Yep. So why is that a problem? Because we have all kinds of things that do that. Well, the problem is that it's not being registered in the system. Yeah. That it's a cost that nobody is paying for. Right. And anytime that happens, the economy doesn't work well. That's called a market failure, right?
Well, it has an impact on all of our lives. And
it does. But it does. If you don't tax it or you don't do something about it, if you don't regulate it in some way, it's something in the system which the system is not picking up. The economic system is not registering that cost. Right. And for an economic system to work, it needs to register costs and benefits. Gotcha. Otherwise, you have market failures. And so how are you going to fix that? Well, somehow you need to put that cost into the calculus of people.
So what kind of failure would you see then? Like you said, market failure.
So what happens, so this is back to basic micro, okay? Yeah. Whenever you have something escaping the system, people allocate resources incorrectly to it. Oh, so for example, we allocate too many resources to things that burn fossil fuels, things that emit carbon, because we're not paying the cost. If we had to pay the cost, we wouldn't burn as much. We would allocate more resources to other places of the economy or to technologies that don't burn as much. Right. So in order to, it's all about costs and benefits in the economy, and to allocate correctly so that we get the biggest value we can in the economy, all those values have got to be present. Right. In the decisions. Of course. And so the fact that we've got this great big cost that's not in there skews everything. Yeah. It means that when we go to the pump and we're not paying for that, we might have bigger cars than we would otherwise, right? We're allocating too many resources to power and not enough to fuel efficiency. Yeah. Well, we're not considering trade-offs completely. So the basis, and this is the logical basis for a carbon tax, is to try to internalize that value. That's why in economics we call it an externality, something that's not being captured in the system.
How come so many politicians don't pay attention to the economics, though?
You wouldn't believe how many, you probably, I mean, you had some econ, but what I said right now is not understood by a lot of people. Yeah. It's just something, it's part of the problem is, like I said, economic illiteracy. They don't understand what's happening around them.
Well, it requires you to spend the time to think about it and actually, you know what I mean? Not just listen to what your buddy said, right? You have to actually go down the rabbit hole and figure it out. Yeah. It requires thinking and energy, and people don't, people are busy. They don't have time, but like they should make the time, right?
I mean, so the basis of those concepts, like you said, those go back to 1950. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. Trying to tax an externality is something which has been around in economics for a very, very long time. And contrary to what most people believe, economists aren't just about, we got to get the economy twirling faster. Most of what economists do is think about market failures, right? Right. How it's messed up and how we might be able to fix it. Yeah. So we're quite interested in policy and what might happen. Okay, so full circle, the concept is that when it comes to carbon, how are we going to fix that? Yeah. Well, you can treat it at its source and internalize the root source of the problem into the economy, so people have to root those costs. Yeah. And therefore, you don't disadvantage solar panels, you don't disadvantage biofuels, you don't disadvantage geothermal. Everybody's responding with their own technology, given the right signals, given the fact that cost that we want to have accounted for is in the system.
So how do you go about calculating the cost? Like the economic cost of carbon.
So
right?
what is the actual cost, right? That's the big question. Yeah. And there's been lots of studies on this. Yeah. But it doesn't matter so much, and I'll tell you why. The first thing you have to do, there's almost nobody who doesn't believe that it's way above what we pay. Okay. Okay? Of course. So what are we paying in Alberta? $20-$30 or something like that. In BC, it's a little higher and increasing. Per ton, yeah. I don't think there's any studies that have been done which have tried to figure out the economic cost of carbon that wouldn't call it much higher than that.
Right.
So at some point there might be an issue if we ever put these things in place and they get high enough to where people say, okay, are we going too high? Mm-hmm. But right now, all of the studies basically suggest much higher values than $20 or $30 a ton.
Right. No, I believe that. Makes sense.
And so, and the logic is, on the regulatory side, the logic is, well, we're never going to get it in at what the true cost is.
Yeah.
At least not now. Maybe as, hurricanes do more damage, maybe as oceans rise higher, maybe as weather patterns, extremities change more and we get more maybe over time people start to believe it more and they'll understand the costs.
I don't even think it's believe it. I think it's one of those things where they're going, well, I live in Canada, like I need a vehicle, because you do in Canada, you kind of need a vehicle most places unless you live downtown. Yeah, you pretty much need a vehicle. Like a lot of these northern communities and stuff like that, you need a vehicle. So they're like, well, I can't use they have to use gasoline. So they don't really have any other options. So they get pissed off when you say you have to use gasoline. By the way, you have to pay extra for the gasoline for this carbon tax. So to them, it's extra. To them, what you're saying is that it's what you're saying is that it should have been there all along. Well, but
carbon wasn't necessarily a problem all along.
We didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's come to have bigger and bigger costs over time. Mm-hmm. And at some point it gets worthwhile trying to regulate it, right? Yeah. You don't regulate every little externality because they're everywhere, right?
I just wonder, I wonder what the best way for that is, because some people might argue well, we can put a tax on carbon when the technology catches up and we have options. But I think the opposite is true in that having the tax on carbon will drive the technology to catch up.
That's exactly the point.
Right.
I mean, why would anybody do the technology if there's no cost?
Right.
It's the cost that drives the technology.
Right.
If it wasn't for regulations in California, if it wasn't for carbon taxes, what would be the incentive for guys in white coats to figure out how to make better batteries for electric cars? Right? Yeah. Unless you can beat on an uneven playing field, the old technology just straight up.
Yeah.
But they're getting the wrong signals, right? Yeah. They're getting the wrong signals. They're not getting the right signals with respect to, but we also do this benefit.
Yeah.
So if you put that into the calculus, then you're heading technology in a much better direction.
For sure. No, that makes total sense. Yeah, because it's so hard for people to see that, though, right? Because most people, I wonder how many people have economic literacy or scientific literacy generally in the public, right? It's not a lot. Everyone's very specialized, right? They have their own specific thing they understand and they know well, but to understand outside of that, but it's interesting to see where it's going to go in the future. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm for it. I'm totally for the carbon tax and all that. It doesn't affect me much right now. And I said that myself. I said, I feel like the impact that it has on my life right now is so minimal. I don't think it's changed my life in any way.
Yeah.
And I feel but the impact that the carbon that I'm releasing has on not just the earth, but the economy as well, and everything is drastically bigger than that, right?
So, which is the first indication that we were talking about earlier. You know what? The true cost is more than $20 a ton. Yeah. Because right now the taxes probably aren't enough to make you change your behavior much. Don't underestimate even the importance of the 20 or 30, not just because it's opening the door, but because in terms of longer term purchases, in terms of technology, in terms of people believing, maybe this really is a problem. Yeah. It could actually change their purchase decisions and cause things to happen.
Absolutely.
But it's probably not changing as much as it could or should or will over time whenever whether and if we start having the true costs of carbon represented in our calculuses.
Yeah. No, it'll be interesting to see where we are in the future here because, like you said, right now it's so minimal. It's what is it on gasoline? I think it's 3 cents a liter, 3% per liter or something like that.
It's pretty small. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's...
Do you think you could see it go to 20 or 30 or 50%? Or
I have no idea. Yeah. I mean, the types of numbers that economists talk about are hundreds of dollars a ton. Mm-hmm. The true cost,
way more than
which is an order of magnitude more than what we're paying right now.
Yeah.
So that would change behavior.
Yeah.
That would change my behavior.
If it costs $5 a liter, it would be some problems for sure. Yeah, it would totally change behavior. It would change the way everything works, right?
Yeah.
Our whole society would just
there
might be riots too.
Yeah, but just to flip this around a little bit, because I always, if you remember from being in class, right, I like to play both sides of this, right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna flip this around for a second though, and point out what I think is the biggest problem of going in that direction.
Yeah.
Right. So the biggest problem of going that direction, even with all that background, that it's a cost that we need to internalize,
Yeah.
But what happens if we do that in Canada and nobody else does?
Oh yeah, we're screwed. Also, yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is that this CO2 thing is truly a world public good.
Yeah. So we need to move forward as a whole, as a planet.
We pay all the costs and nobody else, and everybody free rides on what we do. And you know what? If it's just us, it doesn't matter. What matters is what happens in the biggest economies, in China.
I was to say that poses a problem in China, right? Because China's still developing and catching up to the world stage, and so I don't see them imposing that kind of legislation, right?
Well, that's interesting, and it's changing quite rapidly. So you hit on something on the head, which is that one of the problems is that some of the developing countries are as they develop, they're going to emit more carbon.
Yeah.
Right. And who are we to say, no, you can't do that?
No,
because
you can't.
we already did it.
Yeah.
And we're doing it now.
Yeah. No, only we're allowed. No, you can't have cell phones. What are you doing?
And so there's some pretty big ethical questions there.
Yeah.
But having said that, if you look at China, for example, they've got some pretty progressive energy policies towards renewables. Mm-hmm. They are becoming big enough players. They're having enough wealth. They're having huge impacts. They're not quite the biggest economy in the world yet, but they're heading in the other direction very fast.
Yeah, big time.
In terms of, they're clearly the biggest economy when you think about people and that kind of things. But the United States still has a bigger GDP in there with 350 million people or whatever they are. Mm-hmm. But that's not likely going to last very long. As China, they're still increasing at 6-7% per year, their GDP.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people, a lot of resources that as they develop, they're likely to do that. So anyway, the CO2 that gets emitted from that kind of an economy is a big thing.
Yeah.
And with a centrally planned government like China, they've actually think about these things and move very quickly in some direction. So, for example, they have massive amounts of solar energy that they're messing with. Mm-hmm. They're not treating this thing as just being nothing.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily going to be swayed by world targets on what they have to do there because development is a primary concern.
Yeah.
But they do have enough central control over that economy, so they are seriously thinking about pollution. Mm-hmm. You've seen the pictures from the big cities where they're virtually unlivable.
Yeah.
The people there, that's not CO2 necessarily, that's something else.
Yeah.
But the people there are concerned about pollution, and China has the ability to kind of turn on a dime, right?
Yeah.
One-child policies, and
yeah.
they can do massive things within their system with central planning
mm-hmm.
that almost nobody else can.
Right.
So I wouldn't underestimate, I would be more worried about India.
Oh, okay.
And the fact that there's a huge population there with a developing economy, not as centrally controlled,
mm-hmm.
and the incentives for them or to have some mechanism to regulate that economy for CO2 is a different story.
Yeah, it's a hell of a it's funny because you come across a lot of people who are totally on board, but then you come across way more people that don't even begin to comprehend the argument behind a carbon tax, right? Like and I get it. It's not, they have other things they got to worry about, right? Like I understand it's not their, but I feel like like you said, it comes down to education and literacy, right? But I've said this a few times on a bunch of episodes, actually. And it was something you said to me after I gave a presentation on something. And we had a group presentation in policy, and our conclusion to whatever the problem was, I forget what it was, right? It was like, well, so it turns out like we just need to educate the public and that'll solve the problem, right? And you're like, interesting. And you just kind of sat back and you kind of thought, you're like, it kind of sounds like the solution to every single problem we've ever had ever. It's like, oh shit. So but exactly.
So did I give you the longer version of my response to that?
No, please do.
So there's a longer version of the response too, and I call it the chocolate versus the vanilla argument. Okay.
Yeah, I've heard it.
So let's say that the solution is to educate everybody, and there is something to that, right? There is something that if people understand things differently, their preferences may change, but there's part of their preferences which aren't likely to change. So to assume that just educating people is going to get rid of the problem is wrong. So to begin with, there are things we don't know, a lot we don't know. There's complexities in what we were talking about that may keep this stuff from happening, like what I just said.
Yeah.
But moreover, there's just flat out preferences in there that are different.
Yeah.
And that's where the vanilla versus the chocolate argument get in.
Gotcha.
You like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate ice cream. Who's right?
Me, I like vanilla.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, right? But preferences aren't right or wrong.
Yeah.
Right? Preferences are. And
Yeah.
the fact that we have different preferences means that whenever it comes down to education, that's not going to make you like vanilla and me like chocolate, or
Right.
the other way.
There's always that little bit there.
There's going to be some bits there that are basics based on preferences.
Yeah.
And I might not want exotics on public land because, you know what, I like playing in woods.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit afraid of losing these vast hectares of natural woodland, or whatever you want to call
I
them.
have to admit, I lean more towards that way. I really do.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and so those are preferences, and
Yeah.
those aren't right or wrong. Those just are.
Yeah.
And so you can educate me all you want about, we need to turn, all the forests into plantations, and I'm not going to go there.
No. Yeah.
Um,
There's a balance to be struck.
yeah, there's
though.
a balance.
I can see that there's a balance.
and so
yeah.
people are going to land at different points in that balance, right?
Totally.
The
yeah.
people in the Alberta Wilderness Association were very polite, but they're saying, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And that's not because they're ignorant.
No.
It's because they have different preferences.
They have different values, right? And
So when I say economic literacy, I'm not talking about the world as being stupid and
No.
they're at the wrong spot. What I'm saying is when you add that type of literacy, you can look at questions in a different way, and it could change what you think.
Absolutely.
Your preferences aren't necessarily going to change.
Right.
Those underlying preferences that weigh off those new understandings aren't necessarily going to change. But those understandings are pretty important.
Oh, big time. Well, and I just spoke to this. I had the 2 episodes about ecosystem-based management, right? And that was my question I had to both those people was, like you said, everybody has preferences, right? So everybody has a value that they value higher than the other things, right? So with ecosystem-based management, it's like Alberta Wilderness Society or Association is going to be more biased towards bear habitat and duck habitat is valued more than economic stability or whatever, right? Or whatever it is. And everyone's got their different values. And I asked them, what kind of equation can you create to balance out those values and make the decision? And it's like, who knows?
I like the way you changed that midstream. I don't know if you noticed what you just did, but you started out with the word bias and then you changed it. Right?
Yeah.
Because a bias implies that you're off the true value.
Right. So
Right?
bias is not the word that I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. So you change that, and that's an example of a true understanding of what we're talking about here.
Right.
It's not that I'm biased and they're biased and everybody's biased. No, we all have true values,
Right.
and those values aren't biased; they're just different.
Yeah. And they're based off of our experience and our understanding and
And our
a bunch-
genetics and
everything.
our raising, and
we can go down the rabbit hole there.
Yeah,
Nature
exactly.
versus nurture. Which one is it?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's a super, just like everything I ever talk about on here. It's super crazy complicated, and like people can listen to this and they can take what they want from it. But yeah, like you said, it's not necessarily going to convince everybody. But I think it seems like ethanol is a good way to go. At least, again, it might solve a small portion of the problem, and then other things like solar might solve another little piece, and wind might solve another little piece.
As an economist, I try to stay away from a statement, ethanol is a good way to go. What I do is I say, okay, well, this is worth looking at. So let's go into it and tear it apart and see where we are, where it could be, what it would take to get it there. And then we have some information for decisions.
Yeah.
I can't call it good or bad.
No.
I can personally.
Yeah.
And this might sound schizophrenic because I got to be an academic and I got to be my own person.
Yeah.
But those values are data to me.
Yeah.
Right. And they're not right or wrong. They're just data.
Yeah.
And so I'm out there trying to figure out, okay, I'm not a biofuel advocate.
Yeah.
And that drives people in the networks I work in crazy because most of them are into it because they are.
Gotcha.
But I'm thinking that's not what I do. What
Let's
I'm
look into
doing,
it.
I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's it look like?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to do that without thinking about, is it good or bad?
Which is, that's like nearly impossible to do. I mean, like kudos to you for being able to do that, right? Because a lot of people, they go after the things that they believe in, right? That's what drives them, right?
Well, some people would argue it's impossible.
Yeah.
There's like Kuhnsian versus Popperian science people. This is philosophy of science type stuff.
Yeah.
And some people argue that you can't be value free in research. But there's degrees of that.
Yeah.
At least I believe there are. And I happen to be in a discipline where if I'm not that, I'll get called to task. Right?
Yeah.
I'll get pounded. So
Yeah,
I better have something to say which is beyond just, chocolate is good and vanilla is bad.
Yeah.
Because that's not acceptable in my discipline.
No, that makes sense.
I got to take those as data and work around those things and then figure out, okay, under what conditions would this be a good direction in terms of whatever your values, and how they work in an economy.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, that's good. That's an hour right there. Nailed it. See, like it's just like you're used to lecturing, so there's probably you probably have an internal clock.
I start looking at the time and say, "Oh yeah,
you got a clock behind you. That's cheating." But yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well with the anecdotes, the chocolate and vanilla, and everything else. That's perfect. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot for listening, guys. That was awesome. I really, really enjoyed talking to Marty. He's just like I remember him in school. Just dishing out the info. Yeah. Just schooling everybody all the time. That's just what he does. He just schools people. Love it. Yeah, if you guys have any questions for him or myself, shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. I'll make sure to get back to you, or reach out to Marty, get the answer and get back to you that way, or answer it on the podcast. I haven't done that yet, but we'll see. Maybe. Yeah. Make sure to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, like and share it on Instagram. Tell your friends about it on Facebook, all that stuff. Also, if you're on iTunes, like and rate, like, and comment, something like that. Oh, rate, subscribe, and comment. Yeah, that helps me out a lot. It bumps me up in the ratings so more people can find it when they're searching for environmental science stuff. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it, guys. We will check you out next time.